So we are fortunate to have been joined by our distinguished speaker, Dr. Jennifer Philippa Eckert, to speak on the subject. So Dr. Jennifer is a researcher and practitioner working on development, conflict migration with a special focus on gender, faith, and local approaches. She is a senior research fellow at the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, which is an international network of researchers and practitioners. Her position is currently hosted by the University of Leeds in the UK. Dr. Jennifer has been working on community engagement since the early 2000s and on terrorism and counterterrorism since 2010. We would also be shortly joined by our esteemed discussant, Mr. Abdul Basit, as well, who would add on to the discourse with a more special focus on South Asia. So Mr. Basit is a research fellow at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Mr. Basit specializes in issues of politics, violence, religious extremism, terrorism, and security in South Asia. He has co-authored a book entitled Dynamics of Taliban Insurgency in FATA, published in Pakistan by Pakistan Institute for Peace Studies. In addition to this, he has written extensively in reputed academic journals and mainstream Pakistani English dailies. Mr. Basit regularly appears as terrorism and security expert in a number of TV channels, including the BBC, Channel News Asia, Pakistan Television News, and many other international platforms. But before we formally begin the session, I would like to request Dr. Brigadier Rashid Valijan-Jua, the acting president, IPRI, for his opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Furqan. I formally welcome Dr. Jennifer and other distinguished participants of this webinar. This is a very important topic today that we are going to discuss. And we are indeed fortunate that we have experts like Dr. Jennifer, who is going to explain various dimensions of terrorism and its gender-based variant. Terrorism is a phenomena that thrives on fear, and some define it as propaganda by deed. In order for terrorism to play out, first of all, a violent act has to be there, and after an act, there has to be an audience. And after an audience, there has to be a climate or the mood of fear. And after that fear, there has to be a political motive that is served because of that fear. So in this matrix, the whole concept of terrorism is played out. We are familiar with various variants of terrorism. There is a religious-based, ideological-based terrorism. There is a political terrorism. There is an ethnicity-based terrorism. There is a psychological terrorism. And nowadays, the scholars are talking of economic terrorism as well. Whatever the variant is, the insidious nature of the phenomena creates disorder in societies, and this disorder is exploited by those forces that deal with the power and those who want to impose their hegemony. So it's all about center periphery. It's all about hegemony and those who are hegemonized. And it is all about underdog and a top dog. So in this age of communication revolution, in this age where technology has brought the distances close, and money, technology, people, arms, they all flow unfettered due to the globalization and its impact, which has reduced the barriers. So this has given a new reach, dimension, and lethality to the concept of terrorism itself. And like I mentioned in the beginning, that out of those 5 elements of terrorism, the climate of fear, that is most insidious, that is most damaging for the victims, that leaves a lasting imprint on their minds, that scars people psychologically. And the most vulnerable segments of society, like children and women, those get impacted disproportionately because of the psychological impact of the acts of terrorism. And there's a gender dimension also. And a lot of studies have been done about gender-based aspects of violence and how it impacts women. And Pakistan's context, we have experienced this phenomena upfront very closely. And the exemplar of this phenomena is our Nobel laureate, Malala Yousafzai, who was a victim of an act of terror. And she showed tremendous resolution after suffering that act and became a champion for the rights of women and their rights for education. I think in her example, there is a very shining path for scholars, for teachers, and practitioners to give a kind of a way ahead to all others who are impacted by this phenomena. So it's the responsibility of society, scholars, and practitioners to be aware of those various dimensions, those play into this phenomena, and how resilience could be created in societies to counter these. So with these few words, I'll now hand it over back to Furqan to request Dr. Jennifer for a very enlightening discourse. So over to you, Furqan.
Thank you, sir, for your opening remarks. Now I would like to briefly explain the format of today's session. So first of all, Dr. Jennifer will present her discourse on the subject, and she has a maximum time slot of 40 to 45 minutes. And then our esteemed discussant, Mr. Abdul Basit, who has just joined us, will continue for another 20 to 25 minutes to reflect on the subject with a more South Asian context to this very important challenge facing the region. Now, then finally, we will proceed to the question answer session, which will last for about 20 to 25 minutes. So I would request all the participants to please paste their questions in the chat box, and please mention the speaker to whom the questions might be directed. Now, I would like to request our distinguished speaker, Dr. Jennifer, to begin her discourse on this topic and enlighten our participants with her research. Over to you, Dr. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Furqan, and all other colleagues who have been organizing this behind the scene. Thank you, of course, also for the opening remarks. It's a pleasure to be here. Furqan has mentioned that I'm based in the UK, so I'm saying good morning to you. I'm sitting here with my morning tea, but I am aware that in Pakistan, obviously, it's afternoon, so good afternoon also to those joining from Pakistan. Good evening, in case there's anyone from further east. It's an immense pleasure to be here with you and have this discussion. And I hope that it will be interesting and insightful for you, but also for myself, because it's really engagement and exchange like this where we can learn so much from. So I'm going to start with a little anecdote. Furqan has already mentioned that I have been studying terrorism and counterterrorism for almost 15 years now. And when I started, this was in 2010. So at the time, you may remember that Al-Qaeda was the big organization network that people in international counterterrorism circles, be it practitioners, researchers, or policymakers, were focusing on a lot, right? Obviously, since then, the discourse has shifted quite a bit, and there's new actors that a lot of the attention has focused on. But back then, it was the debates were largely dominated by Al-Qaeda, and there was one big debate between two US-American terrorism scholars, Bruce Hoffman and Mark Sageman, who are obviously still big names today. I think they're still doing research. There must be approaching retirement age, but then we all know that it doesn't always mean much for researchers. They just continue doing research and speaking about it. But yeah, they were actively involved in the debate back then. And it was a debate, the specific discussions that I'm having in mind was a debate about the nature of Al-Qaeda. Was it a centralized organization with one central, like a center of command, or was it more of a leaderless, they were speaking about leaderless jihad, like a loose network of different organizations. And back then, Bruce Hoffman was arguing in favor of the first theory, and Mark Sagement believed that no, it was actually more of a loosely organized kind of structure. And Mark Sagement, in his book back then, which was published in 2008, referred to what he called terrorist cells, right? So some of these loosely organized groups, he referred to them as bunches of guys. And this is something he probably didn't notice himself, but as someone who was interested in gender and terrorism and gender and counterterrorism, this is something that that I found really intriguing, and that really symbolized what a lot of the debates, how a lot of the debates back then and to this day actually still go. So there is an assumption that when we speak about terrorism, that this is something that is perpetrated by bunches of guys. Yeah, and so there is a really strong notion that what we're speaking about is male violence. Yeah, I'll speak about in a moment. I'll speak about what exactly that means and why that is problematic. But this is really one of the things that caught my attention back then, and that made me take a closer look at how we speak about terrorist movements and how we speak about people who perpetrate terrorism, because there is quite a bit of research and practical experience that shows very clearly that terrorist movements do not simply consist of bunches of guys. There is an awful lot of women who are involved as well, and who have a whole range of different roles, both within terrorist movements and supporting them. And really, without all of these women, it would not be possible for the men to perpetrate the violence in the same way. And obviously, there's also cases where women are perpetrators. So that's what I wanted to speak with you about today. Before I delve into the topic, I just wanted to say a few more words about my background. Furkan has obviously already mentioned that briefly, but in general, I find it helpful when I sit in the audience and I listen to a talk, I find it helpful to know who is speaking and what perspective are they looking from what perspective are they looking at the topics that they're covering. So I do work for the Joint Learning Initiative on Faith and Local Communities, which, as Furkan has mentioned, is an international network, and it is registered as a charity. It is an NGO. So but at the same time, my position at the moment is hosted by the University of Leeds. So this is really my perspective. I'm looking at this from the perspective of an NGO researcher and practitioner, but also someone who is an academic at the same time. And I feel this is really important, this positionality, because I often find that there are quite significant differences in how academics or non-academic researchers or practitioners look at these kind of issues. I am German, but I'm based in the UK. I have lived and worked in different parts of the world before that, so different parts of Europe, the US, South Asia. So I have actually lived in Pakistan and worked there for a while. and then different parts of the Middle East as well. Again, I find this myself, I like to have this information about speakers I'm listening to. I hope this will be useful for you as well. I'm going to speak generally and then leave it to our colleague Abdul Basit to contextualize what we're speaking about with a focus on the South Asian context. But that's just to say that I'm not completely unaware of what is happening in Pakistan because, yeah, I have lived there and I still, to some extent, follow what is happening in the country. Yeah, so I think that's enough in terms of background. Let's then go straight into the topic. So there is 3 things that I wanted to discuss with you today. First of all, because I believe it's important to cover basics, I wanted to spend some time to talk about what is gender. What is gender and what is not gender? Because we often use these terms without really reflecting on what do we mean by that. And especially when you bring practitioners in, I feel that often it is actually really important to have a closer look at what terms are we using, what do they mean, and what are the debates amongst academics, but also practitioners and policymakers about what these terms stand for. So that's the first thing I want to do. After that, the second part of my intervention, I wanted to focus on why should we consider gender in counterterrorism. Okay, that's the bit for those who need a bit more convincing that the topic is actually important and not just an intellectual kind of exercise or an add-on that, like a tick box kind of exercise that we need to conduct in order, I don't know, yeah, in order to be up to date with the latest thinking in the area. No, there is actually, and to get funding, that's often one of the considerations as well, right? We want to get funding from donors, so we need to speak their language and know what they're focused on. But no, there is actually more about it. So that's why I wanted to briefly discuss that. And then lastly, really important question is how to focus on gender in counterterrorism. That's the 3 areas I want to cover. I'm going to start with the first one of what is gender. Okay, really, really important question, as simple as it may sound at first, because there is often an assumption that gender means women. And it's just not as simple as that. It's a bit more complicated than that. There has often been a focus on women, but that's because women obviously have been sidelined, marginalized, excluded, and oppressed for centuries, pretty much all over the globe. So that's why it's understandable that there is often this focus on women, but gender is really about our norms and expectations of what a man and a woman are, what they are supposed to be, and the relationship between the two. So it is a relational concept. We can't look at what is a woman or what is our understanding of a woman without also speaking about men. In the same way, if we speak about women's roles in society, we really also need to speak about men's roles. That's a really important point. So it's about norms, behaviors, and roles that are associated with being a man or a woman and the relationship between the two. There has been, I was going to say a long debate, but it's really been more than a debate. It's been multiple debates, often conflicting and disagreeing about the relationship with biology, biological foundations of gender, and then gender as a social construct. I'm not going to go into much detail there because this would be enough material for just one lecture on its own. And we do want to get to the counterterrorism bit eventually. But let me just say that I believe it's important to consider both. but really crucially not forget the social construct side of things, right? So that's another big academic term that people often like to use without really explaining what they mean about it, or assuming that everyone else has the same understanding. When we say social construct, what do we mean? That to a large extent, this is made, right? This is man-made. So when I said before, gender is about our norms and expectations of what a man and a woman is, these actually vary quite a bit. And if you look beyond your immediate environment, right, and that could mean going to a different country, right, going to a different part of the world, or even within your country or within the city that you live in, if you move, I don't know, from a very middle class, prestigious, elite university, you then go to a more working class part of town and visit maybe also a university there, but one that has much less resources and that is frequented by students from more working class backgrounds. You will already notice that in these different contexts, there are different understandings of what a man and a woman is supposed to be, should look like, should behave like. Okay. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to get out of the way first, right? Just to make sure that we have the same understanding of what I'm speaking about when I'm speaking about gender. The most important takeaway for most people in counterterrorism spaces, from my perspective, would be that it's not just about women, right? So that's the most frequent omission that I am observing, that people say gender and then they start speaking about women a lot, and somehow the roles of men and of masculinities, right? That would be our understanding of the characteristics of a man is often missing, and it's that simply doesn't allow us to focus on the whole picture. You can't change the condition of women without also involving and considering men. So that's that, the first part. Then I said I wanted to speak with you about why should we consider gender in counterterrorism, okay? So that's for the people who came to the lecture today but are still a bit skeptical. Trying to win you over now. So, I mean, ideally, we would just say gender is really important. And where is gender? Where is it relevant? The answer is everywhere, right? So ideally, that would just be our response, and it would all be very straightforward. But then we do know that that's not always the case. So what I would then respond to someone who expresses skepticism of why should we focus on that? There's already other things we need to focus on. There's only so many resources that we have, right? Like, can we really afford to invest more resources, more time and more effort on now also focusing on gender? And really what we're trying to do is to prevent violence, right? And prevent damage and harm to our communities. And then I would say to you that gender really plays a significant role throughout the entire process of terrorism and how terrorism occurs, right? So it starts with people's motivation to join or support a terrorist movement, right? These motivations, I mean, obviously we know what debates in the last decades really have focused on. We know that there's a debate about is it ideology that makes a difference, right? Is it grievances? Is it economic deprivation? Is it political grievances? Is it economic considerations? That's the whole grievances versus greed debate, right? Now, when I say let's focus on gender, this is not to deny the relevance of any of these other factors, but it's really to say that gender plays a role in each of these areas and each of these stages. So yes, political grievances, they might play a role in motivating a person to join or support a terrorist group, but this is very likely to be experienced differently by a man or a woman. Okay, so let me give you an example here from the UK. We had when ISIS in Syria and in Iraq started becoming a thing almost 10 years ago now, there was quite a bit of a debate about how Muslims in the UK feeling marginalized and excluded and isolated by large parts of mainstream society and policy discourses about Muslims that are to a large extent characterized by Islamophobic and racist takes, right? We're saying that this is something that motivates people to then turn around, leave British society behind them, and instead join an Islamist group in the Middle East that promises them brother or sisterhood, unity, and based on a shared identity as Muslims. And now these are feelings that may be shared by men and women who then decide to join a group like ISIS. But a woman who here in the UK wears hijab is going to have a different experience, right? It's because she is targeted in different ways. She experiences Islamophobia and racism in different ways. So that would be one example, right? We have the same outcome in the sense that they both end up joining the group or supporting it, but the experience is gendered and the motivation is gendered. The next point to mention then, when we speak about why should gender and counterterrorism be considered, is that the groups that we're talking about use gender strategically. Okay, so they do this during recruitment and they do it after recruitment once people have joined the group. There is quite a bit of research that shows, for example, how Al-Qaeda had in their magazines aimed at members and supporters, how they used imagery and language to convey that there was a place for both men and women in the movement, right? So I remember pictures for the men, it was lions and fighting skeins and like images of what a lot of people associate with masculinity, and then also masculinity in the context of Islam and in the context of militant Islam. And for women, they would put pictures with, it would be flowers and lots of pink. So they really thought about how to appeal to their audiences in very gender specific ways. In terms of what happens after recruitment, we see the same. And I told you at the beginning of the talk that I am originally from Germany, so I will use an example from Germany. There's research and practical experience that shows that right-wing extremist movements in Germany, that they also very strategically use men and women in different ways. For example, for public demonstrations or public protests, they will often put women in the front lines of the protest because they know that a woman is considered to be innocent, harmless, non-violent, right? Especially if, and that's where then things like race come in, especially if she's a white woman, maybe even blonde, right? So all of this plays into our perceptions of what that woman or man that we're looking at is like. And then obviously that reflects on the movement or organization that they are representing. And then lastly, we could also use examples from non-violent political violent political movements from all over the world. And I'm thinking of the LTTE in Sri Lanka, for example, or in my own research, I focused on socialist and Christian groups in Lebanon in the 1970s and 80s a lot. And we can see from all of these examples across the ideological spectrum that women are often also used in combat roles, to strategically used to surprise an enemy, to move more easily through territory that's held by the opponent, which could be another non-state group, or which could be state military. Again, strategically using these stereotypes of, oh, she's just a woman, she's not going to hurt anyone. And there's multiple of examples, multiples of stories of how women used hid explosives under their clothes, right? It looked like she was pregnant, but it was not a baby, it was a bomb. Or women who would hide weapons in prams, in baby prams, and so on. So these stereotypes that women are innocent and peace-loving, and women are victims of terrorism, or they're peacemakers. Yeah, so this idea that women just are inherently closer to peace and non-violence than men. Men, on the other hand, they're perpetrators of violence. They are supportive of violence. They are the problem. We hear this so often. This is so widespread, and it's just not based on empirics. When we do look around, there are women who commit terrible acts of violence in pretty much every conflict around the world. So this is a very, very common stereotype that is extremely widespread. And I think it prevents us as people who want to help prevent violence and who want to help counter violence. It prevents us from seeing the full picture. If you're just focused on the man, you're not focusing on the woman. It makes it much easier for organizations and movements to exploit that in the ways that I've mentioned, right? The man can't move freely in the territory, you end up sending a woman. Or in some cases, there is also examples of men who dressed up as women. There's actually examples from Afghanistan that come to mind where this was in the 2000s, so quite a while back. But where male operatives would hide under a burqa, right? And because they knew, again, that they would be less likely to be stopped at a checkpoint, and it would make it easier for them to get around. So if violent groups use these gender stereotypes strategically, intentionally, to achieve their aims, then if we want to prevent or counter violence, we need to do the same. We can't be lagging behind. We cannot afford not to integrate gender into our analysis and into our approaches, into our responses. It just doesn't make any sense. The other thing then as well is that if we are serious about reintegrating people into our communities, into our societies after they have left a violent movement. And I don't know what you think about it, but from my perspective, this is really the only way, because you can't kill them all. Ideally, you don't want to kill them all either, because that's just plain unethical. But even if that were your approach and you had this really hawkish kind of approach of, oh, we're just going to eradicate them, horrible approach, but we know that there are people who hold these positions. even if that were your approach, we know that it just wouldn't work. It's not possible, right? You can't eradicate an entire movement. It's just not possible. The approach of leaving them lingering in camps, like what is happening right now in parts of Syria, in Iraq, I mean, that's not a viable approach either. And I don't think we need to spend much time discussing that, because it's pretty obvious that it's not working and completely not ethical either. So really what we need to focus on is the reintegration of people. Now, if we want to reintegrate people, we need to consider the individual circumstances, and we can't treat them all, we can't paint them all with the same brush and treat them as if they were all the same. A woman who was part of a non-state violent group, who maybe has children, maybe has many children, like is the case in many right-wing European movements, or also quite a few Islamist groups. They also promote having many children. So let's say she has 5 children and you want to reintegrate her. Like, how is that going to work? You need to think about it. That's something different than a single male former member of a group like that. So that's why we really need to speak about gender. We really need to think about what is our approach, because it matters before people join, once they have joined, and then if we speak about reintegration and de-radicalization. Now, if then the next question, because I said I want to speak about 3 things, right? I said I want to speak about what is gender, we've covered that. I said I want to speak about why should we consider gender and counterterrorism. We have touched on that now briefly. If then the third question is how to do that, how to consider gender and counterterrorism. We've already spoken about avoiding the pitfall of equating gender to women. That's like the very basic. I'm assuming we are in agreement on that, and can move on to the finer details of the topic. The next point, and really one of the very first, very crucial points, is to address your stereotypes. Okay, so in a European context, in a US context, I would be saying to counterterrorism officials, I would tell them, think about, like, reflect on your stereotypes of Muslim women, of Muslim communities. If we're speaking in Muslim majority context, then the issue might not be Muslims as such, because a lot of the counter-terrorism officials, they come from Muslim societies themselves, they come from Muslim backgrounds themselves. But then maybe the issue is class, or maybe there's ethnic differences, right? Maybe there's differences between urban and rural parts of the country. So really, really important to address our stereotypes in that area, and to make sure that our approaches are based on evidence and not on assumptions. Related to that, really important to reflect on who we're taking knowledge from. Okay, who do we consider experts? Who is invited to talks like this? Whose work gets cited and who is missing? Who is considered credible and neutral, right, subjective, and who is considered biased? Really, really, really important questions that a lot of people from minoritized backgrounds I could tell you, as a Muslim woman who has been working on this issue for almost 15 years now, I have a whole lot of stories that I could share about some of these issues, right? How you are not considered. When I speak about Muslim groups, I'm often not considered neutral because I'm Muslim myself, but then a white non-Muslim colleague, they're considered neutral. I mean, oh my God, right? Let's speak about that. There's an issue. There's a massive issue in a lot of international counterterrorism circles. Very briefly, the last couple of points. So we've spoken about gender. We really, really, really need to speak about gender in a holistic and in a comprehensive kind of way. What I mean by that is to take an intersectional approach to gender. That's another one of these big terms that it's really important that we have common understanding of. When I say intersectionality, I am thinking of the work of Black feminists in the US who in the 80s started to thinking about how different parts of their identity shaped their Black women's experiences in society. So Kimberly Crenshaw, for example, she actually she coined the term in 1989. She wrote about how when people spoke about Black experiences in the US, they had Black men in mind. And when people spoke about women's experiences in the US, they had white women in mind. So who was being left behind in these debates was Black women, okay? So in the same way, we could have a conversation about how when we speak about Muslims, we often speak about Muslim men, and we just assume, we don't even speak about Muslims, we just say Muslims, and we assume that it's men and men's experiences that we're focusing on. Or when we speak about women, then we often also mean a certain type of woman, right? So I don't know, in Pakistan, for example, we speak about women. We are often going to think of a woman who lives in an urban context, who is from Karachi, from Lahore, from Islamabad, right? We're not from a middle-class background who speaks fluent English. We're not going to speak of a poor woman who lives in a village in Balochistan or other parts of the country, right? So that's really important. We need to bring in gender, but also look at what role does race, ethnicity, class, religion, education, disability, and so on play, and how do they interact with gender. I probably running out of time, so just very, very briefly, a few more points before I finish up and hand over back to Furkan and then to Abdul Basit. Holistic responses, okay? So we really, if we say that gender matters at every single part of the journey of an individual, of an individual's relationship with a violent organization or movement, then we really need to think about all of these steps as well, right? And we need to think about what are different experiences at different parts of the journey, what factors do play a role. I've mentioned debates about what is it that brings individuals to groups, and we also know that there is no single answer. If any of us had a single answer, we wouldn't be sitting here discussing. We would be, I don't know, having a really well-paid job and making lots of money. But because we do not know for sure, and there is actually in lots of cases it's multi-causal, right? So yes, ideology plays a role to some extent, but economic factors are important, political factors are. So we really need to consider all of these and develop responses that take all of these into account. One mistake that people in international counterterrorism circles, and that's researchers, practitioners, and policymakers that I'm speaking about here, often make is they do not consider all types of extremism or violence in the same way, right? So this is something that, again, as a Muslim woman, I find extremely frustrating. People say, we're going to speak about terrorism, and you're like, oh, this is great, this is interesting. And you go to the talk or you read the book and there's 5 speakers or 5 chapters, and 4 out of them speak about examples from Muslim majority contexts. And that's just really frustrating because that's not in line with empirics. Terrorism is an issue all over the world. There's all sorts of ideological expressions of it. There is non-state terrorism, there is state terrorism, and we are not going to get very far. And in fact, we're going to cause harm by taking such a biased approach to the topic and by over-focusing on some examples and not speaking a lot about others, because people notice. Our work is not happening in vacuums, right? People, they know how we're speaking about them, and this does create resentment and feelings of exclusion and marginalization. And then last but not least, really, really important to build long-term strategic and inclusive partnerships, okay? So if we say we want to focus on gender, we do not want to then say, oh yeah, let's bring in a woman and let's invite a woman as a speaker once we have already laid out planned our approaches, right? The programs are already set and ready to be implemented. We want to include men and women from a variety of different backgrounds, from a variety of different communities. And we want to create with them together, with communities together, approaches to help counter terrorism, because this is an issue that really, there's not one single agency or one single actor that can counter terrorism on its own. It's really something we need to do together. And on that note, I'm going to finish and hand back over to Furkan.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer. This was a very insightful views from you, and especially highlighting that how important integrating the gendered perspective is in counterterrorism strategies to combat this threat. Now, I would like our esteemed discussant, Mr. Abdul Basit, to please share his comments on Dr. Jennifer's presentation and share his views on the subject, especially in context of the South Asian perspective. So, Dr. Abdul Basit, Mr. Abdul Basit, sorry, welcome to the debate, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Furkan. Can you all hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
okay,
you're
great. Thank you. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be part of this webinar. I learned a lot from Dr. Jennifer's talk. I do not know what to add to that. She has covered all the important aspects of the subject, but I'll be brief and try to add from the South Asian context. Just one note that while I do study, violent conflict actors in South Asia, per se, I'm not an expert on gender dimensions of violent extremism. So my comments are of a generalist or of a commentator or someone who has observed the landscape in South Asia. So I'm speaking from that standpoint. I don't claim to be an expert of this particular dimension. I do believe times have changed. Terrorism as a phenomena, as a strategy, the groups that use it as actors, and as ideology has evolved quite a lot. The landscape has undergone a massive transformation. What we used to know terrorism as synonymous, as Dr. Jennifer said, back in the day, like a couple of years ago, the height of the so-called global war on terror was synonymous to Islam or Islamist organizations, right? But we have a situation now where we have, if you look at the phenomenon of terrorism from David Rappaport's work and looking at it as waves, we had 4 waves of terrorism, and maybe we have now entering or have entered, this debate is ongoing, 5th wave of terrorism, where religious terrorism and ethno-nationalist terrorism, these 2 waves are coinciding. Generally, what has happened in the previous 4 waves is that one wave subsided and another wave replaced it. But here we have a situation where there are 2 different forms of terrorism, religious and ethno-nationalist, which are, coexisting parallelly. So the religious wave of terrorism has weakened, but it is still resilient and it persists. And you have, an upsurge of ethno-nationalist terrorism, referring to the rise of the 100 group in India. We have some Buddhist groups, extremist groups in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in Thailand. We have, white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi groups, and there is an entire spectrum of them, from right to left, who have emerged in the West. So you have this situation. And within this evolving situation, definitely the roles of gender have evolved. The stereotypes that were associated with terrorism and the roles of females, those stereotypes have been busted as well. So we have to situate the debate within this broader context of knowing where are we headed and how within that transition which is taking place, how the roles of genders are evolving. Now, straight to South Asia. If you look at South Asia, if I quote some very recent example, last year in April, we saw a Baloch female militant, Shari Baloch, who carried out the attack at the Karachi University's Confucian Center, is one example of how females, not just within the jihadist groups, but within the ethno-separatist groups, are coming out, as in active combat roles. And she was a female suicide bomber. And if you read further, the propaganda which came out from the Baloch group said she isn't the only female, who has enlisted herself. There are others as well. Look at Islamic State of Khorasan province, for instance, or Daesh Khorasan, as it is known in our part of the world. In 2017, we had the case of this medical student from Liaquat Medical College, Hyderabad, who enlisted herself for bombing on I think for Easter celebrations in Lahore. So she was recruited online. She was intercepted, arrested, and was rejoined with her parents. Likewise, we have seen at the height of Daesh, when people were moving from different parts of the world to Syria and Iraq, there were alongside other militants from Pakistan who went there. There were females as well. I remember some names. There was this lady, Baji Shameen from Lahore, who went there with her children and defied her husband. Her husband never wanted to go there, but she went anyways. If you look at the case of the Safura Churangi attack, 2014-15 in Karachi, I'm forgetting the year. If you look at the backgrounds of the perpetrators of those attacks, you got to know that wives of and females of educated urban wealthy families were involved in raising funds for the group. They were proselytizing the ideology of the group. They were even involved in matchmaking of the would-be jihadist males and females. They were doing this. I do remember in the Friday Times there was this article published, terrorist bombs, that had the entire background of different females, who they were and what were they doing. As this happened, with ISK making inroads, recruiting women, and diversifying their roles from more typical to more proactive roles. We see in 2018, if I'm correct, interestingly, that TTP, or the Taliban Pakistan, brings out a magazine, Sunnat-e-Khawla magazine, specifically aimed at women, attract women towards the group. Uh, More interestingly, the magazine is in English. So definitely the aim of that magazine was not to lure women from the tribal areas. It was aimed at educated urban Pakistani women, uh, professionals. Uh, so TTP, the way TTP categorized the roles of women in that magazine, only two issues came out, just two issues. If you look at those magazines, you'll see that they talk about combat roles first, and then the more typical roles of women secondly, as nurturers of the future jihadist generations. The first role was the more primary roles as combatants, and they quote examples of from the Islamic history of women participating actively in the war, like giving waters to the wounded in the battlefield, those kind of examples. And this happened because they felt that they were lagging behind in attracting women to their ranks as compared to Daesh. So that brought out that change in them. Then we have, Al Qaeda South Asian franchise, Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, or Qaeda Jihad, in Varanasi. They had a dedicated women militant wing within their organization known as the Shaheen Force. They publicized that. They in their propaganda material they claim to have about 500 women in that wing, which I think is an over exaggerated figure. But even if they had the wing, the militant wing with say about 50, 60 women, that's a game changer in a sense that that is enough to tell you that the roles of women in South Asia have evolved, particularly in Pakistan and other regions. So the point I'm trying to make is, you look across the spectrum, Baloch separatists, the case of Shari Baloch, and I profiled, this lady, the Simple for Jamestown Foundation, and the one question that I asked was, and what intrigued me was, what pushed her over to the other side, of why she crossed the fence, took the big step. I looked around, uh, uh, or in other words, I was trying to, retrace her trajectory to radicalization. And I found that, in her family, there was no immediate family member who fell victim to, repression, like for instance, kidnapping or was a missing person, nothing of that sort. Nobody was arrested, you know. So then what? If no one in her family was, fell victim to what they refer to as state repression, then what was wrong with her? Why did she do it? I looked at her background. She comes from a very educated family. She had a master's in biology from the University of Cork, if I'm correct. Uh, Her father retired as a government servant. One of her uncle was a university professor and intellectual, in well-known intellectual in Balochistan. Her siblings are well-educated. One of her sisters had a PhD. Her husband is a dentist. So educated, middle class, had a good job, two kids. What's wrong with her? And the only answer I got was then in her student days, she was affiliated with Baloch Student Organization, used to read Latin American revolutionary literature, and used to participate in uh, protest organized by BSO. Uh, what changed her mind from protest activism to militant activism was, you remember this Baloch activist, this lady Karima Baloch. She was killed or died somewhere in the West. And that is when she was radicalized. That is when she moved to Majid Brigade of VLA and enlisted herself for suicide. mission. So it was an interesting insight that how she got radicalized. And that's not just confined to Pakistan's case. You look at the Bangladeshi case. You look at groups like Neo GMB or Neo Jamaatul Mujahideen Bangladesh, which is again a Daesh affiliated militant groups, and you will see consistently there are female suicide bombers. Most of them are, they detonate themselves when their houses are when police raids their houses, they blow themselves up. And here the question gets interesting that are they doing it by their own will, or have they been forced into doing it to save their marriages? Sometimes they're doing it because they want to save their marriages because their spouse, the husband is a militant. To save their marriage, they become a militant as well, because that's the only way for them to do it. Sometimes they do it out of their own accord. They exercise their own agency. They want to explore their own identity, and they go down that path. We have those cases of women going to Iraq and Syria, and they became the so-called phenomenon of jihadi brides. Those cases are there as well. But sometimes they are daughters. The father is a militant, and the entire family becomes that because that's for them to keep the family together. So the Bangladeshi case is a bit more complicated. Then we have cases in Sri Lanka, if you remember, the bombings that ISIS did, Easter bombings, if I'm correct, they did. Several churches and hotels were attacked. The post-attack investigations, revealed there were wealthy families, educated, wealthy families were involved, and within that, females were also involved. So one of the lady whose husband carried out the attack. The husband was a son of a very wealthy businessman in Sri Lanka. So there were two brothers. They detonated. He was survived by his wife and two sons. When their house was raided, she also blew herself up with her two sons. So she definitely did it because her husband was a militant. And then there are other cases. The Dr. Jennifer talked about it. The history of Tamil tigers having female suicide bombers is very well documented. Everybody knows about it. In India, if you look at the Hindutva, that space, they have females as well, but we can't categorize them typically they are extremists, violent extremists for sure. It is questionable whether they're terrorists or not. Definitely they are violent extremists. And there are participations of female, in that space as well. And we have the example of Nupur Sharma, for instance, who passed, insulting remarks about the Prophet, and she was then, removed from the party, and we know what happened afterwards. So what I'm trying to say is these dimensions are there as well. Now, with all these, scattered instances that I quoted, if I try to sum up what I'm trying to say is that the roles of gender have evolved from more secondary in South Asia, from more secondary to more primary roles. In their secondary roles, the women were recruiters, they were propagandists, they were perhaps, they were collecting donations, they were involved in some instances in matchmaking, they were seen as the bearers of future generations of the jihadists, and they were told that was their role. And when I'm talking about this, it is important to, contextualize or discuss how Al-Qaeda view the role of women and how ISIS or Daesh saw the role, because that is where you get the answer of why these roles have evolved. So if you look at Al-Qaeda and the way Al-Qaeda saw the role of women, and you will come across letters of Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri's wife. She wrote those letters, and the kind of roles she defined for women in those letters was that you belong to the four walls of the house. You have to sit home and nurture the future generations. He's very, very categorical about it. He wrote those letters, and so more typical roles. You have to be wives, you have to be mothers, you have to be sisters. That is what that was the bottom line of various letters that she wrote. And then you have ISIS or Daesh, and they were talking about more active roles for these women. And that is when Al Qaeda was challenged, and that is when we saw these other organizations like TTP and others, bringing out these magazines, Sunnat Khawla and others. So the role of women evolved from more secondary to more primary roles. They became combatants. We saw that they even carried out suicide bombings, so on and so forth. So then finally, the larger question is beyond this AQ ISIS tussle and evolution of terrorism, because we are living in times where we have a new generation. So the roles of gender have generally been evolved, and that evolution has impacted terrorism as well. So the larger question then we should be asking is, what does it mean from a counterterrorism standpoint in the South Asian context, and why this has happened? So one argument is, for instance, in the case of TTP and Baloch separatists, was they are struggling to recruit, right? And now in desperation, they are trying to use women. That's one theory. That's one argument or one hypothesis. They are struggling, so they are relying on women now. The counter argument to the same is, or the counter hypothesis is, or not really, they are expanding alongside men. Now women are also participating. So the threat has become more complex. Which one is the true? I think the truth lies between these two extremes. Because if you look at it more critically, you need to have data. You need to have data to answer whether that is the case. So for instance, in case of Shari Baloch, there is only one female suicide bomber. That was April last year, and no female suicide bomber since then has carried out a bombing, right? Noreen Nagari is one case, and there are a couple of women, maybe 15, 18 of them, who went to Syria. And then beyond that, there is no number. TTP, yes, published 2 magazines, but we didn't see TTP has used female suicide bombers, yes, but recently that isn't the case. So the numbers maybe tell a different story, but whatever the numbers tell you, they don't tell you the entire story. They don't tell you the entire story. So the roles are definitely evolving, but whether it is desperation or whether it is expansion, I think you have to have some data and more nuanced, in-depth analysis to know the accurate empirical answers. I can only speculate, but I have given you both position of what does it mean for females to, join these organizations in combatant roles. The other aspect of it is that women are exercising their own agency. So if there is quest for recognition, search for a sense of belonging or a meaning in life, or if there is an urge to serve a higher cause or atonement for, some people say that people do it because they want to atone for their sins and want to serve a higher purpose in life, right? Right, serve Islam. So that is not specific to males anymore, or females are coming forward, and they are, going along the same trajectory as well. They have identity. They are looking for the same answers. And I think here I would like to emphasize the role of social media as well. Social media has opened up, and diversified, and made recruitment more inclusive. It has lowered, social media in a way has lowered the entry barriers for males and females both to join these organizations, right? So you don't have the intermediaries anymore. I think you could be directly in contact with the relevant people maybe. So that has, I think, has played a huge role in terms of why we are seeing more women in active combat roles within these organizations. I think, and the last point, just to repeat what Dr. Jennifer said, at times it is easier for societies like ours, traditional Muslim societies where women are subject to less stringent security checks. It is easier for women to, pass through these security checks and be able to detonate or whatever. And nobody, I mean, if you don't have female, police personnel posted alongside their male counterparts to check females on roads, and that's not the case, we know, in Pakistan, not in Bangladesh as well, then a male police personnel is not going to check a female thoroughly, what she's wearing, blah, blah. Easier to go through those checkposts and bypass them, right? That could be another reason why females are being used. Lastly, then what do you do with the counter strategies? Dr. Jennifer again has talked about it at length. I'll just say we have to factor in gender roles from a counter-terrorism and counter-extremism standpoint as well. Not only on the kinetic side, but on the non-kinetic side as well. The question of identity, for instance, is an important one. We have to keep in mind that individual trajectories of radicalization for each person could be very different. The set of reasons which could radicalize me could be different from what could radicalize person X or person Y. So you have to study with more empirical data why women went down that path, and that would inform you what kind of counter strategies you are needed. We need, police, women police wings. They are there, but I think we need to do more on that count from the situational and operational awareness standpoint, from counter narrative standpoint. The de-radicalization of families has become an important question concerning the women and children which are there at the prison camps in Syria. These questions will, in going forward, will be important for us to consider in our own context of how militancy is evolving in Pakistan and the broader South Asian regions. I'll stop here and happy to listen to Dr. Jennifer during Q&A and answer any questions that are directed to me. Thank you, Furqan.
Thank you, Mr. Basit, for the insightful reflection on the subject. Now we'll move on to the question answer session. I would request all the participants to be brief and precise in the questions so that our speakers have the maximum time to respond to as many questions as possible. We already have some questions here. So the first question is directed to Dr. Jennifer. What role do you believe has the education system played to decrease gendered violent extremism? So it should be like more generally the education system and its role in decreasing gendered violent extremism.
Yeah, thank you, Furqan, and to the person who asked that question. I think, I mean, this is quite a general question, and it also depends very much, again, on the context, right? Which I think is something that has come up both in mine and Abdul Basit's interventions. But I'll still try to answer it generally and briefly as well, to make sure we have enough time for all the questions. So our education systems, our schools and our universities, they are part of our societies. So the same gender stereotypes, the same issues that we see in society as a whole, they are reflected, usually they are reflected in our schools and universities as well, right? So sometimes, especially with universities, sometimes there is this idea that universities are these beacons of progressiveness and intellectual openness and all of that. But I mean, we all know that this is not really the case. To some extent, yes, but not as far as one would hope. Yeah, so basically the same issues we're facing in society, we're facing in our education system as well. So they are part of the problem to a large extent, right? Because a lot of these gender stereotypes, a lot of the security-based narratives that make marginalized communities feel excluded, they are perpetuated in these institutions as well, which is a shame because, as the question hints at, in a way, there is huge potential, right? So if we manage to find ways in which we can work with educational institutions to counter some of these issues and help address some of the grievances that often lead to involvement in terrorism and political violence, and to address some of the ideology as well, that would be fantastic. And we could reach so many young people who are often particularly vulnerable when it comes to terrorist narratives. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of work to be done. Yeah, let's just leave it at that for the sake of brevity. In principle, a lot can be done, but de facto it's difficult. Also because a lot of schools and universities, they're facing immense pressures in terms of funding cuts or lack of resources in the first place. The question is also, who would we work with? Do teachers actually have the relevant background, right? We would actually need to start training them. The examples that I can think of are from outside of formal education settings. So I'm thinking of NGOs that work with schools and that work with universities and do amazing work here. In the UK, there's an NGO called Connect Futures, which do really, really fantastic work in this area. But yeah, I think with our more formal educational institutions, there's still a long way to go. And that is without even touching on issues such as the informal education and school system in places like, for example, Pakistan, where you have the whole madrasa system, which is like a parallel system. I mean, you know that better than I do, right? Parallel system that is often where, yeah, the reach of the state doesn't often go very far at all. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. There's more to say, but let's just keep it brief, short and brief.
Thank you for the answer. We have a second question that is directed towards Abdul Basit Saab. Can you explain how TTP may use women in its bid to cause violent extremism in Pakistan? Mr. Abdul Basit, your mic is off.
Sorry. Thank you. So, as I said, TTP has used female suicide bombers in the past. I remember when late, chief of Jamaat-e-Islami, Amir of Jamaat-e-Islami, Qazi Hussain Ahmad was alive. He was visiting Muhammad agency. There was a suicide attack on him. They used a female suicide bomber. And there are other instances as well. There were, in this case, of two sisters from Swat when the terrorism was at its peak in Pakistan. I'm talking about the 2008, 2009, those years. There's these two girls, two sisters, Sabah and one more, I forgot the name. Our esteemed colleague, Sabah Noor, she teaches at National Defense University, Islamabad Peace and Conflict Department. She has written a paper on it as well on women radicalization. She has detailed that case. So it's the use of female suicide bombers and women for radicalization purposes with TTPs as old as the organization itself is. But as I said, we have these instances are very sparse. So the data set is very narrow. But I don't, as I said, I don't fall for the narrow data set because for me, what is important is that the numbers do not tell the whole story. So we have to go beyond numbers. So I think going forward, because the roles of gender are evolving, these groups, they keep evolving with times, with circumstances, their adaptability, their regenerative capacity, and their resilience is tremendous. So I think to survive and to stay ahead of the curve, they will definitely, they will continue to evolve, and the role of women in these organizations going forward will become extremely crucial. How they will do it, I cannot answer that. We will have to wait and see. But what I can say for sure is, based on the available evidence, is more active participation in combat roles, and that is most likely to be in the form of suicide terrorism. Number one, we might see more of them, on social media trying to lure more women, because radicalization is through networks of families, networks of friends, networks of colleagues. So it's easier for women to recruit a woman rather than a man to recruit a woman in these contexts. So more participation in recruitment roles, and then we might see them bringing out their own magazines or propaganda products. It could be anything, videos to infographics, so on and so forth. So these are the roles that I can imagine for now. What exactly, what shape do they take? We will have to wait and see for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Abdul Basit, for the answer. We have another question directed at Dr. Jennifer. We acknowledge that women actively take part in terrorist movements, not only as auxiliaries, but also as active part perpetrators. But why is it that we do not see them in leadership, decision-making roles, neither in the terrorist organizations nor in the counterterrorism measures that the states take? This is not specific to the third world or Muslim or patriarchal societies, but it's a global practice.
Yeah, thank you to the person who asked that question. Again, I keep it brief, so I apologize in advance if I can't give as many details as the question would deserve. But hopefully this is just some pointers to help us think this question through. So the first point I would like to make is that actually I would not underestimate women's roles in non-leadership roles. Right? Like you can have the most brilliant leader, but he or she on their own are not going to get very far. So in a violent movement like the ones that we've been speaking about, it is actually it is the membership as well beyond just the leaders that are really important, and that includes both violent and non-violent roles. So that's just a caveat before we begin. My second point would be that we have actually seen women leaders in a range of different groups that have used terrorism. So ETA in the Basque country would be one example. They had a female leader. Some of the socialist and communist groups that were active in Lebanon in the 70s and 80s, they did as well. In my own research, I interviewed several former female leaders of these organizations. And then another example, again, I'm using one from my own country, from Germany, the NSU, the right-wing extremist organization that we came aware of around 10 years ago. They also had a woman as part of the core leadership. So there are women, there are less women than men. Why is that the case? Both in the groups themselves and then also in the counterterrorism structures that are trying to prevent and counter their activities. These groups and the institutions, again, they are a reflection of our societies, right? And women are they are excluded from many leadership positions in our societies. Of course, we have seen some progress in recent years, but we're still nowhere near a point where we could say, okay, we have full gender equality. That applies to societies like Pakistan as much as it does apply to a place like as the UK. So I would say that's the main reason. That's just how our societies are structured. At times of extreme pressure, this can change, right? To some extent, temporarily. This kind of links back to the question that Abdul Basit was asked just now about what is it that makes women participate. And it's often the security context that a group operates in or that individuals live in that play a really important role, right? So when we say that, oh, there was a woman who blew herself up as part of a suicide mission, if we look a bit closer to what happened before that, we often see that these are women who've lived in really, really difficult circumstances with significant repression by the state, human rights violations, and so on. So this doesn't come from nothing, and it's often security pressures that push women even into combat and then even into leadership roles.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Jennifer. We have another question directed at Mr. Abdul Basit. What is your assessment of the role of RAW and India's involvement in stoking BLA terrorism in Pakistan?
That's not related to the debate of the role of genders, but I think the primary issue in Balochistan, whether it is BLA or other organization, is internal, and then Indian agencies have exploited it. Earlier, they were doing it through Afghanistan. Now they're doing it through Iran. We know Kulbhushan Yadav was arrested from Iran, was operating in Iran, was arrested in the border area. So definitely, India is playing an active role. In fact, if you look at the mergers and alliances of various separatist groups after or just before the US withdrawal, is one reasons of these. For instance, Brass was Baloch Raji Joi Sangha, which is a coalition of about 4 or 5 different groups. It came into being because of difficulty to handle individual groups remotely. That is from India. Earlier, various consulates were handling these groups individually from Afghanistan. But now, because the desk has been merged, so these groups have been asked to form coalition as well, so coordination becomes easier. So India's role is quite active for sure in providing finances, in giving strategic guidance. But the initial triggers of the conflict are based in ethno-nationalist grievances, political alienation, economic deprivation, so on and so forth. So the role of India is undeniable. It is there. That should answer the question.
Thank you, Mr. Abdul Basit. We have another question directed to Dr. Jennifer. So in terms of the impact of terrorism, women have equally been affected by it, if not more. But when it comes to the policy response, it's mostly male-dominated. How do you suggest to bridge the gap in policy making?
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. How to bridge a gap? Oh, wow. I mean, again, this is a big question, and we only have a few minutes left. So I think one really important point is awareness raising. We could do much better if people were more aware of what some of the issues are. This is why events like this are so important, right? Where we can have a conversation about these issues, where people can learn about what exactly do we mean when we speak about gender? What do we mean when we speak about gender sensitive counter extremism and reintegration measures? There is trainings that are available for people who work in these spaces, but then again, without awareness of the importance of gendered responses, they are unlikely to be taken up. So I think, yeah, awareness raising, debates where we bring in different perspectives, right, from different people and involving the people who are most affected by it. That's really important, because I can give a talk about gender and counterterrorism, but I'm going to speak from my experience. I have a specific experience. I have a specific background. So I want to see more events with a really wide range of different speakers from different backgrounds who can help us shed light on these various questions. The other thing is that it's really important, like these international debates are important. There is a place for them, but we then really need to break it down and look at specific contexts. And I feel that this is something we've actually been doing in this event here, right? I gave a general kind of global overview about things, and then Abdul Basit helped us contextualize this for the South Asian context. And this is so important because context is so important when it comes to these questions. So I hope that if you engage in counterterrorism debates, if maybe you are a counterterrorism professional yourself, I hope that you think more about these questions, that you continue thinking about the questions, that you can continue to engage, that you make an effort to try and hear from different people, from different backgrounds, including from the communities that are most affected by these counterterrorism measures that are being developed, and often being developed without the inclusion of the people most affected.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer. We have many more questions here, but because of the time, we will have to limit this to only one last question. So this could be towards Mr. Abdul Basit. Women have rallied for peace worldwide and have been at the vanguard. Does that form a theme for countering terrorism as we go on to cement the narrative? Or you think it is a stereotype example primarily? Iran is a prime example where women have faced state-centric high-handedness.
I think the role of women, whether as peacemakers or whether as radicals, are as complex and evolving and diverse and vibrant as the roles of their male counterparts. I think that was the primary purpose of this event, to shun those stereotypes and dispel those myths that you only park women in certain pre-assumed roles or see them in those frameworks. I think we need to look beyond those frameworks. So when we talk about including gender dimensions in counterterrorism and counter-extremism, we are obviously talking about inclusion of women within those structures as well. So the debate has to be, you can't have a one-sided debate. Even if the empirical base is narrow, the very fact that they are there, that perspective has to be part of the debate. So they have to have those chairs and seats on the table as well, represented by women experts, whether they are academician practitioners women experts from other fields, communication specialists, DRAD, coming from the DRAD side. Their perspective, the gender perspective has to be there to see the similarities and see the differences. And that's the value addition. So inclusion of women, definitely yes, but I cannot and I like just assumed them in one role. I think it's more complex. I mean, some Dr. Jennifer maybe can briefly reflect on it because she could give more nuance to it. But the way I see it, more inclusion of more women in PCVE, not just the conferences and asking them to write papers, but in the practitioner community. Yeah.
All right, so because of the limitations of time, we'll have to formally bring this session to an end. I hope the discourse shared by worthy speakers has been of as much significance in our research to all the participants as has been to me. And I extend my special thanks to our distinguished guest speakers, Dr. Jennifer and Mr. Abdul Basit, for taking out time for this session and sharing their valuable insights on the subject. I also thank all the participants for patiently listening and bringing some very important questions to the